Hi there, I'm James Ankrum, professor of biomedical engineering. I do research on regenerative medicine and teach undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Iowa in biomedical engineering. And I took this last week's seminar for second year students and asked them to submit their biggest questions regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is the class that I did to share answers to those questions, response to those questions. And I know many of you have asked similar questions, so hopefully this will be helpful for you as you navigate this current season. All right, so way back in the third week of seminar, we talked about COVID vaccines, and we talked about Operation Warp Speed, right? And so we talked about this process that was in place to speed up the vaccine development for COVID-19. And so there's questions that came in, how was the process sped up? Doesn't that make the vaccine less safe, less tested? So just to recap a little bit and try to squarely hit this, it's important to consider how the process was sped up, because I think when you say that the process was sped up, the assumption is like, well, we sped up the cooking of a turkey, right? Like I only took 30 minutes to cook a turkey instead of the normal 3 hours. Well, that'd be bad because we'd all get food poisoning. But the reality is we didn't just make it shorter. What was done with Operation Warp Speed are really three important things listed here. The first is that there was shifting of financial risk from companies to the government. So this is specifically true for the Moderna and AstraZeneca, the Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm at Oxford here, not Pfizer. Pfizer didn't take government money directly, but Moderna and AstraZeneca did. And so what this did is that the risk associated with developing a therapy that you have no idea if it'll work or not was carried by the government and not by the companies. And so that allowed Moderna and AstraZeneca to really go all out, with full speed research and development, full speed recruitment and enrollment in clinical trials, because they weren't paying the bill for that, right? So if you are unsure if your product works, you might start with a really small trial and based on some of the early results, decide whether or not you want to keep recruiting more and more people. Or you might start with really, a smaller animal study and then repeat that with a bigger animal study. And you'll use time to kind of hedge your bet against your risk so that you're not spending a ton of money just to find out that it doesn't work. Well, what Operation Warp Speed did is it said, well, the government will take the financial risk, so just do this as fast as you can. And so that's what really enabled Moderna and AstraZeneca and a few others to really, launch forward with this, because they didn't shoulder any of the financial risk. So they have an upside with no financial downside. The second bit was the coordination. And so traditionally, the company that's making a therapeutic or a vaccine, the regulatory body are completely disconnected. So they'll have meetings where the company can ask questions and the regulatory body will provide answers that are non-binding. So they'll say, well, we'd like you to have, at least 5,000 people. But then they're not saying if you do a 5,000 person trial, we will approve your therapy. They could come back a month later and say, well, actually, yeah, we said 5,000, but we actually wanted 10,000. And what's changed here is that from the start, the regulatory body was involved in the design of the trial. So how many patients, what are the endpoints, how often are we following them up for safety, what things are we measuring? So the regulatory body was involved from the start. It's really controlling the trial design and expectations of the trial so that the first time the trial was done, it was done as the regulatory body, the FDA, expected. This is really different than how we normally do it, with companies kind of guessing and doing their best, but then the regulatory body kind of nitpicking and criticizing the method that the company used. In this case, they sat down at a table and the FDA just said, do this trial, and the NIH said, we'll pay for it and we'll actually help enroll clinical sites around the country. So there was a highly coordinated effort around trial design that really smoothed out the process of getting the trial going and making sure that the trial that was done according to the expectations of the regulatory bodies. And then third, the production and distribution of the vaccines was started before approval. This like never happens. So during the actual, initial initiation of the trial, production of the vaccines had already started. And now distribution has already begun, even though the first meeting to approve these vaccines isn't until the end of next week and into the following week. So December 10th is Pfizer's decision day. December 17th is Moderna's decision day. And yet the vaccines are already being shipped around the world to hospitals and various pharmacy distribution networks throughout the country. So there's really a parallelization of tasks instead of a linear one is what has allowed this to really be sped up, along with the government willing to, again, shoulder a ton of risk. You can imagine if these trial data had come back really bad, and let's say it was only 10% effective, well, that's not going to get approved. And so the government would be, on the hook already for, they'd already have made, 40 million doses. And the government would have just said, fine, that was worth the risk. We'll just burn all that because it doesn't work. And, we'll go on to the next one. Whereas if you were a company, you wouldn't want to make 40 million doses until you knew you had a product that actually worked. You wouldn't invest the money in scale up and manufacturing and distribution before you knew that your product actually worked. And so with Operation Warp Speed, the government is taking the financial risk to go ahead and make a product and distribute it before we actually know whether or not it met its endpoints. And so this manufacturing has been ongoing for months. The distribution started in the last couple of weeks, even though the approval dates aren't until another week and a half from now. So a question came in, what happens if the vaccine is not approved? So the approval documentation is a couple thousand pages for each of these, which is why it's taking some time. But based on the high-level summary that has been made public so far in terms of the effectiveness, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the number and severity of adverse events, it is highly, 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 highly likely that both Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine will get approved. So they need to go through the rigorous approval process and have all that data analyzed and make sure it's right, but it's highly likely that they'll get approved. If they're not approved, that product would either get warehoused or it would get destroyed. You could get warehoused in basically just wait. Maybe the regulatory body could come back and say, we want you to do 2 more months of follow-up before we approve. So we have 2 months of follow-up data, we want 4 months, in which case they could just sit and store those doses, presuming they can be stored that long until that additional safety data became available. Good question. And so here's just kind of directly from the documentation trial design. As part of the Accelerated COVID Therapeutic Interventions Vaccines Partnership, NIH and Health and Human Service agencies and government partners in collaboration with academia, philanthropic organizations, and pharmaceutical companies advise on the trial protocol design and endpoints to ensure a harmonized approach across multiple vaccine efficacy trials. So what this is getting at, and what you'll notice, is pretty much all of these companies are doing trials with 30,000 people in them. And they all have the same endpoints of, how many people had symptomatic COVID-19 within 2 weeks, after 2 weeks after their final dose of the vaccine. So there's really, really harmonized data monitoring with these and approaches to actually conducting these trials. So here's what this looks like. Again, just the compare and contrast. The really linear typical process is upper one. And remember, in this one, the company is shouldering all of the financial risk. They don't get any money until they have actually sold a vaccine. And so, along the way, they want to be fast to market, but they don't want to be, so arrogant or overconfident that they blow through billions of dollars and have nothing to show for it because it failed along the way. And so what happens when you take out that financial risk and have the government shoulder it, is that the companies are able to put a lot of these things in parallel. So instead of recruiting 1,000 patients a month over 30 months for your 30,000 patient trial, you can recruit all 30,000 of them within 6 months. So that takes a ton of money, a ton of effort. And you wouldn't normally do it if you were paying for all of it, because you might want to, see how the numbers looked after 10,000 patients and then decide if you wanted to continue to recruit patients or not. And this big kind of goldish brown bar up here, this is manufacturing. So manufacturing right here. So at the start of the clinical trial, manufacturing was started, doses were being stored, made and stored, all the way through this process. And then here, the distribution has already begun as well. Even the distribution has been a little bit parallel with some of the trials. So there's really a high degree of making these parallel processes instead of this typical linear process here. And so what you hopefully you're seeing is that what didn't change was the bar. The hurdles that need to be cleared were not lowered and they were not taken away. Instead, what happened is that they were coached on where the hurdles would be and how to overcome them. So it was really clear that everybody was on the same page of what was expected for a therapy to get approval. What does the trial look like? What should the endpoints look like? What should the safety data contain, so that when it does get to those actual approval dates, that there shouldn't be missing information because it was coordinated from the start. Okay, I'll go to the next one in a moment, but real quick, what's wrong with hydroxychloroquine? It doesn't work. There's been about a half dozen trials looking at hydroxychloroquine right now. It does nothing for COVID patients. It doesn't prevent it. It doesn't lessen severity once you've already been diagnosed. It does not do anything for severe COVID. So there's quite a few trials that have been out there now looking at hydroxychloroquine. It doesn't work. That's not in this particular slide deck, but I'm happy to send you some of those if you like. But yeah, hydroxychloroquine was a waste of time and a complete bust. But we as in the research community spent a lot of time talking about a drug that has no benefit. All right. Any questions on warp speed? As I go warp speed. Okay, if they are, we can come back to it. Put them in the chat. How do RNA vaccines work? How are they different than traditional vaccines? This is a fun one. And really, we're going to put your foundations of biology, cell bio for engineers to work here. So how do vaccines work? Specifically, how do coronavirus vaccines work? Coronavirus vaccines work by exposing patients to the spike protein. So on the surface of the coronavirus is the spike protein, this guy here. And we need the body to see that because that's the thing on the outside of the viral particle that we can mount an immune response to. And so the way that this is typically done, and this is a harmless virus, this is really the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is using a virus that is not the coronavirus, but we're engineering a harmless virus to make the spike protein of coronavirus. So that when this virus is injected into a patient, the virus infects cells. So when you inject it into a patient, their cells start to make the spike protein. That's not normal. So your immune system sees it. They start making activated killer T cells and antibodies that recognize cells that are displaying the spike protein and mount an immune response against it. So we've got an immune response. And the great thing about our immune system is that it not only responds to new pathogens, but it remembers new pathogens so that the next time that a virus comes into our body and infects one of our cells, our T cells and our antibodies are already kind of primed to see it. There's memory in our system that can quickly be reactivated to destroy the virus before it can actually multiply and infect most of our cells. So this traditional system uses a virus to make the viral protein to kind of force its expression in our cells and therefore elicit this immune response. Now, mRNA is very different because instead of using a virus to deliver the genetic code of the protein we want to make into our cells, we can use a different strategy. So there's really, 3 different strategies being used. The viral one we just talked about on here, where we've got a really benign virus that's been engineered to express that spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. There's a smaller one here where it's Novavax is doing this one, or they're just delivering the spike protein itself. And then there's the mRNA vaccines up here, which are both Moderna and Pfizer or mRNA vaccines. And so here we're just delivering not a virus, but just the messenger RNA that encodes for that spike protein. So that when we put that inside of a human cell, our ribosomes will transcribe it into the viral protein. That then will elicit an immune response from T cells and elicit an antibody response as well. So that's the mRNA virus. And if you remember from biology, or if you take cell bio for engineers, it's the central dogma of biology, which states that our genetic code is encased in DNA. Our DNA can be transcribed into RNA or messenger RNA, and then that messenger RNA gets translated into proteins. So we have this 3-step process: DNA to RNA to protein. DNA is in the nucleus and lasts for decades. So this is what's in all of our cells. Every one of your cells contains DNA, the same copies in all of your cells. The mRNA, the stuff that's made in between, is kind of like, a napkin at a bar that you write a phone number on really quick. It is not meant to last very long. It is a very, very short-lived message that does not last long. In fact, the median life of an mRNA, strand of mRNA in your cells is just 2 minutes, and then it's destroyed. So these messages are very, very short-lived. They're in the cytoplasm, not the nucleus of your cell, and they're destroyed within minutes after they've been produced. And so within those few minutes, they interact with ribosomes, which make them into proteins, and those proteins can last for hours to days. So what we're doing with these RNA vaccines is we're giving the RNA this really short-lived message, and the cells can then quickly translate that into proteins that then can last for hours to days in your cells, long enough for your immune system to come, see those spike proteins, and generate an immune response to them. So why use mRNA rather than the traditional viral method? Well, one of the biggest things is that these vaccines can be made rapidly. From sequencing the virus to the first candidate, it took just a couple of weeks, like 3 weeks, from when we had the first sequence of this novel virus back in January to having the first candidate of an mRNA vaccine developed. And then secondly, the production uses chemistry instead of biology to produce the product. So nucleic acids are very simple chemical constructs. It's very easy to develop RNA products. And so we don't need cell culture or chicken eggs or anything like that to make these. All we need is large chemical reactors to be able to make large quantities of this RNA. And then finally, mRNA's short half-life should theoretically make them safer. So since they're destroyed so quickly and they don't have any of the rest of the kind of viral machinery or packaging, they could in the long term end up proving to be a safer route of giving somebody immunity than using a virus, which are already pretty safe. Okay. Again, if you got questions, keep them coming. If it's something I'm going to hit on a little bit later, I'm holding off on it. But keep your questions coming, and we'll keep going. Who will get the vaccine first? When will everybody get the vaccine? This has been a hot topic on both ends of the extreme, from they're going to force everybody to get it to there's not going to be enough, and how do I get my grandma to be first in line. So the last time we talked about this, there was ongoing effort to put together, I believe this was actually open for comment in our seminar in week 3, open for public comment, where they were looking at, here is the proposed approach for vaccine allocation. This was put together by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So these are the 3 basically national honor societies of the best scientists, engineers, physicians in the United States are members of it. I am not a member of any of these. Most universities in the US have a handful of members of the National Academies of Sciences. So, for example, Ted Abel, who runs the Neuroscience Institute, and Dale Abel, who's the chair of medicine, they're both members of the National Academy of Medicine here in Iowa. Most of your faculty are not. These are people that are the cream of the crop, best scientific minds in these 3 areas. So these academies got together and put together this recommendation for how do we equitably distribute the vaccine, with the first phase going to high-risk workers. So you can think of this as all of your healthcare workers, your doctors, your nurses, your first responders, people that have really high comorbid conditions that we know put them at high risk, as well as folks that live in overcrowded, older patients in overcrowded settings. So this could be like your long-term care facilities, those sorts of things. And then phase 2 was recommended school staff, critical workers in other high-risk settings, people of all ages with comorbid conditions. Phase 3, then young adults, most of you, children, workers in industries and occupations important to functioning society. And then phase 4 is everybody else. So really starting with, who's most at risk and essential. So those are the 2 kind of bits to weigh of who's likely to be exposed, and when they're exposed have a bad outcome. Those are kind of the first 2 bits that were really prioritized in this, and then on down to those that have a less likelihood of exposure and less likelihood of a really adverse response. So this is what's recommended by the best of the best that we have in our country, and here's what we're doing. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, said last week that the initial batches, at least, of COVID-19 vaccine will not be distributed based on this. Instead, they will go to states based on population. So what that means is that even though Iowa is having a worse outbreak than, say, Maine is right now, Maine will get doses based on their population, and Iowa will get doses based on Iowa's population, and there will be no consideration for the current level of outbreak for where we distribute the vaccine. You could think that's right, you could think that's wrong. This is completely up for debate. The rationale was given, we wanted to keep this simple. We thought it would be the fairest approach and the most consistent. So they basically threw this out and went with a population-based distribution. That said, many states that are getting the vaccine are saying that the states are going to use this guideline. So even though at a national priority level, this isn't being used, for who gets it within a given state, many states are using the National Academy's recommended phases. What conditions are considered to be high risk? Things like having an autoimmune disease, having COPD or asthma, being of an advanced age. We know particularly the case fatality rates really skyrockets when you get up into the 50 plus, 60 plus, 70 plus groups. Those groups get really, really high underlying risk of having a really adverse option. The children bit, I wouldn't be surprised if that actually gets punted to phase 4, both because they don't have very much of a response to the virus and because we don't have clinical trial data yet in children. And so I could see this group in particular getting punted over to phase 4 for both of those reasons. Okay, carrying on with how do we get the vaccine out there? How will they be distributed? Will the National Guard be used? This has been talked about in some of the national news. And so let's just look at this. So here's the official map for two of the vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. This is operational warp speeds. This came out early last week. Yeah, about a week ago, right before Thanksgiving. Their vaccine distribution process. So both Pfizer and Moderna are doing what's called fill and finish. So they're putting their product in vials, putting it in its original packaging. Pfizer is doing their own logistics. So they're transporting the vaccine directly to UPS and FedEx for shipping to distribution sites. While Moderna, Moderna is a startup, they're a relatively new company. They are using a distributor, this McKesson Distributors, to help with the packaging of their vaccine with needles, alcohol wipes, etc., gloves, to then get sent to FedEx and delivered to the places where the vaccine will be delivered. And as far as where it will be delivered, they're taking a all of the above approach. So in this case, F, all of the above is the answer. They're shipping it to hospitals, outpatient clinics, pharmacies, long-term care facilities, individual doctors' offices, Indian health services, public health clinics, mobile units, homebound patients, and other federal entity sites. So they're trying to get this as many places as is possible. So that's what you don't see in here is the National Guard. So it's unlikely, at least it doesn't appear to be in any sort of plans that we've seen yet. Now, individual states control their own National Guard. And so could an individual state decide to set up a mass vaccination with staffed by National Guard members? They theoretically could. It does not appear publicly in any concrete plan that I've seen to date. What they are doing is really targeting pharmacies. So pharmacies are known to be distributed throughout communities around the US. Both large and small communities typically have a pharmacy. Most people have a pharmacy they use, right? So we go to the CVS by the engineering building, or we go to Hy-Vee North Dodge, or whatever our pharmacy might be. So they're really trying to hit on those. And so they've got partnerships already with pharmacy chains that cover about 60% of all pharmacies in the 50 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and US Virgin Islands. So that's pretty good coverage already to get over half of all pharmacies in the US in this network already. And that will really be important for some of these underserved areas like rural communities. Now, the elephant in the room in a huge engineering challenge is cold chain requirements. The cold chain is how do you ensure that your product remains cold throughout the entirety from production to final delivery to the patient? How does it maintain the appropriate temperature the entire time? mRNA in particular is very fragile and unstable. And so if you don't handle it appropriately, it will be destroyed. So this is something that's going to affect what vaccine goes to which location, not just within the US, but probably more importantly, worldwide. So if you look at these, we've got the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the Moderna, the Pfizer, and I pulled this from a BBC article. And so they had the Russian vaccine on here as well. So the Russian vaccine and AstraZeneca are pretty similar. They're both viruses, traditional. Moderna and Pfizer are pretty similar, both RNA. You'll see, though, that there's a big difference in storage temperature. So the virus-based vaccines are fine in the fridge. So a normal refrigerator like you have in your apartment or your house is fine to store these for weeks to months. Those will be great for any place that is relatively rural or lacks lots of infrastructure. So much of the developing world is probably going to have to wait for large amounts of the viral-based vaccine to get delivered, while those places, urban areas and places that have really strong logistical networks that can handle the cold chain requirements will be able to deliver the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which require -20. So this is -20 is your normal freezer in your house for the most part, maybe a little bit colder. -70 is dry ice temperature. So this is really, really cold. And dry ice only lasts for a few days. So you've got to really have your logistics down to get this to people that need it. So these vaccines will likely not have much reach to large portions of the world because of their cold storage requirements, while these vaccines could have reach really globally. All right, has the vaccine been shown to be effective for minority populations? I have not seen the broken out data, so because it hasn't been published yet. What we've seen so far have been summary releases from companies that have shown the collective data. What I will say is that minority recruitment was a priority for the FDA, for the NIH, who funded these and are going to approve it, and for the companies. And so Moderna's vaccine in particular, out of the 30,000 patients that they, 30,000 participants that they recruited, 37% of them were from racial and ethnic minorities. So this is higher than traditional recruitment, even though it's lower than desired. But recruitment of racial and ethnic minorities is really, really difficult. And there was a heartbreaking question and response that the FDA did a couple weeks back of just hearing concerns from people from underrepresented communities who are really hesitant to participate because of the history of just, you know, wrongs that have been done against communities in the past. So this was a priority, and we'll have to wait. Hopefully, after those FDA meetings on the 10th and the 17th, we'll start seeing published results that will actually have a breakout of not just overall effectiveness, but our effectiveness amongst specific groups, whether it be age demographics or amongst racial and ethnic minority demographics. All right, what does 94% effective mean? Does that mean 6% of participants had bad outcomes? All right, let's do some math. So here's how they do the math for percent effectiveness. So these vaccines are 30,000 patients, 15,000 get the placebo, 15,000 get the vaccine. What happened in the Moderna trial is 185 people in the placebo group got symptomatic COVID, while in the vaccine group, 11 people got symptomatic COVID. So what the question we ask when we are actually talking about percent effectiveness is we are asking, of the people who would have gotten COVID, what percent didn't because they got the vaccine? Okay, so that's the question that the effectiveness is asking. Of the people who would have gotten COVID, what percent didn't because of the vaccine? And so we do that mathematically by saying, okay, well, if I take the number who would have gotten it without the vaccine, which I know it's 185 people, minus the number of people who got it with the vaccine, that was 11, I'm left with the number of people who didn't because of the vaccine. And then if I divide all of that by the number of people who would have gotten it without the vaccine, again, 185, I'll get the percent effectiveness. So if we do that with 185 minus 11 divided by 185, we get 0.9405, which is 94.1% if I round up. So this is how you calculate effectiveness. It's not that 6% of the people, 6% of this 15,000 got COVID-19. No. Of all the people, there were 196 who got it, 185 in the placebo group, 11 in the vaccine group. If we assume this difference is due to the vaccine, how effective was the vaccine? And we do that by doing this math. What is the fraction of people who didn't get it because of the vaccine divided by the number of people who would have gotten it without a vaccine, which we actually know is 185. So it's not that complicated. And so if you see numbers about this, they're easy to run, but don't fall into the trap of multiplying 94.1 times 30,000. That's not what the trial was about. All right, but fun, simple math. Okay, with development sped up, has it been tested on fewer people? This is a good question, and I had to dig up to find a solid answer. So I went up and found, here's a review article that looked at the phase 3 vaccine trial size since 2000. So we've got a good sampling here. About a dozen different vaccines have been tested since 2000. And here we have their phase 3 trial size, phase 3N. And so what we see if we take the mean and median of these is that the average trial size for vaccines since the year 2000 has been 29,844 participants. The median, 22,938. And each of these COVID-19 vaccine trials is enrolling 30,000 patients. So we are not sacrificing trial size or number of people tested in the name of speed. Instead, we are recruiting patients faster to these trials, which is really expensive, but still getting to that 30,000 subjects within each trial. I got a question on this. Is the effectiveness value not accounting for workplace exposure? Did a larger portion of placebo participants work in hospitals as opposed to vaccinated participants? So these are all these trials with 30,000 patients. They're really broadly selected. So they recruited from specific demographics across age, education, workplace types. So they're really, really broad across that. And then they're randomly assigning people across those demographics to either placebo or the vaccine group. So you've got relatively match between people of different ages and occupations between placebo and vaccine. The subjects also do not know what group they are in. You do not know if you're in the vaccine group or the placebo group. So it's a completely blinded study until the end of the study, and then you're finally told what group you were in. So no, there shouldn't be differences due to these extraneous circumstances because they were controlled for in how the trial was designed and how people were distributed to each of the two groups. So the more of that will come out when we see the full data. We'll get to see exactly how what we refer to that is it was a trial balance. Did you have 945 people 60 to 65 versus 700? Well, that's not balanced. Or was it 945 versus 947, which is well balanced, right? So ideally, you've got people that are in each various kind of facet of demographic are equally represented in each of the groups. And we'll only get to see that once the full trial data is actually published. But with the FDA in the trial design process, that was baked in from the beginning as an expectation. And so it's likely, and the full expectation is that it will be there when the full data is released. All right, we're trucking through this. What are side effects of the vaccine? There are some. Soreness, fatigue, fever, headache are the main ones. This is one that good to have conversations with friends and family about. This was an article that came out a couple days ago in Science, the 27th. Public needs to prep for vaccine side effects. So side effects are not common and severe ones are not common. So for the Pfizer and Moderna, 2% of recipients developed severe fevers. Let's see, yada, yada. Other transient side effects would likely affect more people. So things like, here we go, 9.7% of the participants had fatigue, 8.9 muscle pain, 5.2 joint pain, 4.5 headache. Pfizer's had a little bit less side effects, fatigue 3.8% and headache 2%. So yes, there are side effects. They tend to be very short. So these tend to be, the 12 hours after the shot is when these side effects occur and then they resolve. The COVID-19 vaccine causes a larger immune reaction than your typical flu vaccine. And this is something that I think is important just to set your expectations at the start. That's normal. You should expect and be prepared for a larger response to feel pretty crappy for a day or so after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. That's not going to be a surprise. We saw that in the trial for these vaccines. We see in other vaccines. So the things like the tetanus vaccine or the varicella vaccine for shingles has a really strong immune response, and people feel horrible after getting the shingles vaccine, but they work really well. So just set expectations. It's not going to be as benign as a flu vaccine for some people. Not a ton of people. These aren't huge numbers, but this is 1 in 10 people. So A good number of people are going to feel crappy after getting this vaccine, but it should go away within about 12 hours, and you should be back to normal. Will this be a vaccine people have to get every year like the flu vaccine? And will the same vaccine work for multiple strains of COVID-19? These are great questions that we have partial answers to. Here is the mutation map of SARS-CoV-2. So from the first strain back in January to where we are today, we've got a couple thousand variants that have emerged. The good news is that the trials that have taken place are taking place in sites around the world. So they're not just North American trials. There's sites in Europe and Africa and South America and Asia. And the vaccines appear to be effective everywhere, which is a good indication that the vaccines are effective against the vast majority of these strains. And that the mutations aren't significantly changing that spike protein, which is what we're using as the antigen in all these. The other little piece to take to heart, and just a point of comparison, is that the seasonal flu mutates about 4 times faster than the SARS-CoV-2. So the seasonal flu is a shot we get every year because the seasonal flu mutates pretty rapidly. SARS-CoV-2 is mutating at a rate that is just 1/4 that of the seasonal flu, which means that we could get a vaccine that's effective for longer than a year. Now, we're only 11 months, 12 months into this, 12 months from the very first documented case in China just this week. So we're still in the early days of knowing how long immunity will last. So time will tell, likely 12 months or more based on what the data look like so far. Patients have been seen that had natural infection have immunity 6 months out after their infection. That was a small study published, 41 patients that had 6 months, 6 months out of their COVID. And the vaccine appears to induce a very strong response. And this is an article that came out last week talking about that, there are some vaccines that we've developed that the vaccine is actually a stronger response than natural infection. So things like tetanus vaccine, again, or the Gardasil, the HPV vaccine, those vaccines are much, much stronger immune response than natural infection. And so they actually give better protection than natural infection does. And so there's some initial evidence that might be true for the SARS-CoV-19 vaccines, but we won't know until we have some time, under our belts to really, really test the effectiveness. And so what I'd say right now is that this could, in the short term, be an annual vaccine, but maybe in the long term is a every other year, every 4-year type vaccine. Wow. We've got 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left. What other questions can I answer? Was that helpful?
Yeah, I thought it was very informative. Thank you very much. It answered a lot of the questions that I had. I know I mentioned in my response about the National Guard. So I know that President Trump has mentioned it more than once. So I figured it would be interesting to see if we're planning on using the military's distribution network or not. But apparently Warp Speed has other ideas.
Yeah, it's one of these confusing things that, can you all see the attendance code, by the way? Thumbs up? Or no?
I can't see it.
Okay, I'll post it. Attendance code is 2226. So despite the White House being in charge of most of this, there's not always agreement between what the White House says and what Warp Speed is actually doing. And there's some other little things in there as well. For example, that the federal government doesn't control the National Guard. So every state controls their own National Guard. So it wouldn't even be up to the White House to use the National Guard. It takes pretty severe circumstances for a National Guard to be nationalized. So,
so sorry, I was using it as a catch-all term for either National Guard or domestic military, but but
it's been interesting to keep tabs with. One other thing I'll share with you in the chat if you're interested or have family. I did a podcast series with my sister-in-law and I talk about a lot of these things. So there's 3 episodes on Spotify that you can take a look at and send to family and friends if you like, that are very layperson. So this is a blog, a podcast she does for young parents. And so I talk about things at a very lay level. So the kind of question, is there a way that the presidential transition could affect vaccine production distribution? I think the biggest one would probably be in the priority bit. So the initial doses are going to go out under the Trump administration, and those are going by state population. But once the administration changes over, they could choose for the next round of doses to instead go based on, say, what states have the highest positivity rate or have the highest, rate of growth of COVID infection, to try to get, put a lid on things. So you could think of different ways to be strategic about where you're putting, when the whole country is on fire, where do you start spraying water? Hotspots. Hotspots is where you should go spray the water, is where most people would say. But how do you define a hotspot? Is it based on population density or infection per population, or just raw numbers? There's lots of points of debate there. Any other questions?
Are they ranking like government officials and people in power as like the first phase, or are they just doing it based on like health and circumstances?
People in power have not been listed on any of the priority lists that I've seen. It's always been thinking of, let's see, at least the National Academy's ones. Yeah. So high risk health workers and first responders. So I think phase 2, this critical infrastructure and industries, high function, critical to the function of society, is where you'd probably put government officials, which are with your K-12 teachers. So they're not in the head of the line according to the national academies. Now that said, again, each state has control of their own doses to start with.